Welcome, everybody. Just want to take a second to thank you all for joining me to talk about Marketing Cloud Transactional Sending. Can everybody hear me okay? Quick thumbs up. Great. I also wanted to start out by just getting a quick survey of the crowd. How many people here are familiar with Marketing Cloud? A lot of you. How many of you currently do transactional sending through the Marketing Cloud? A few of you. Okay, so this is really designed to be a kind of an introduction, but I'm also going to go into best practices. So some of you that are completely new are going to learn a lot. Others that have already experienced will still hopefully go away with some best practices or some tips that you can implement. Introduction, I'm Michael Clark. I'm a product manager for the Marketing Cloud. I work on the messaging team that handles our transactional sending platform. Been with Marketing Cloud 8 years. I've worked with a lot of developers, helping them implement Marketing Cloud transactional sending along with a variety of other technologies. And of course, the forward-looking statements slide I have to show. I don't really plan on talking a lot about forward-looking statements today. It's really about stuff that's available in the application today, but I might go off on a tangent. I might get questions at the end that kind of lead down that path of functionality that isn't necessarily available, and you just need to make your purchasing decisions based on what's actually out there today, not any statements that I make today. So a little bit about the agenda. I'm just going to get a little, kind of give a baseline of what is a transactional send, so just kind of define that. I know when people think Marketing Cloud, they think of marketing send, so you're thinking of huge audiences sending really fast for marketing campaigns. Transactional is a little bit different use case, but still goes through the Marketing Cloud and can use the the power of our email sending engine to get those out the door really quick. So going to touch base on that, and then I'm going to go into really two challenges that I find that a lot of developers face when first being tasked to implement transactional sending through the Marketing Cloud. So a lot of the developers I've worked with, they want to just immediately get into writing code, and there really are some prerequisites and some concepts that are specific to the Marketing Cloud that we need to go over so that you can get started right away writing code after you get these prerequisites done. So the first one is just talking about triggered email definition, and then also talking about how you manage different levels of content within the Marketing Cloud. So starting off with the transactional overview, what is a transactional message? So just kind of break it down. There's two basic types of messages through the Marketing Cloud. You got commercial, which is what everybody is aware of. It is when you're sending out large number of messages to a big audience. Those are typically marketing. Those require different pieces of content for canned spam compliance, such as physical mailing address and an unsubscribe mechanism. Transactional is a little bit different in that the regulations aren't quite as, are just different. So you're not required to offer an unsubscribe mechanism, so it's a little bit different in that regard. The technical legal definition is a communication that facilitates, complete, or confirm a commercial transaction that the recipient has previously agreed to enter with the sender. So yeah, real fun legal definition there. But basically, it's just any time a user takes action or has specifically requested the message and you send it, that is transactional, as opposed to marketing, where it's not really a solicited thing, but you're sending it to them after they've opted in, of course. So just to kind of give some transactional examples, I'm sure you've all received all three of these. This is by no means a comprehensive list of all transactional examples, but we've just got receipts. So you've purchased something online, you're going to get a receipt with your total and all the details. Password resets. So you forgot your password, you need to get a reset token, or maybe they'll even send you your password, which is a bad idea. And then maybe a shipping notification. So once your order that you submitted ships, you get another email for that. And then there are a variety of different mechanisms for sending transactional messages through the Marketing Cloud. Transactional messages are a little bit unique in the Marketing Cloud in that it definitely does require an API call. So it is the probably most common scenario that a developer would get involved with on the Marketing Cloud. So if you're sending marketing messages to lists or data extensions, that's all a UI function. You log in, you select who you're sending it to, you send the content. With the transactional messages, or transactional message, that request has to come from an external system. So we don't know, within the Marketing Cloud when somebody orders something until we get that trigger. So there are different mechanisms for making that request into the Marketing Cloud. Most popular, SOAP. So we've got a SOAP API that's been around for a long time. It's very feature-rich. It is very stable. It is probably the most commonly used mechanism for sending transactional messages. We also offer a REST API. The REST API is called the Message Definition Sends route. It is very similar to the SOAP option. It doesn't support quite all of the functionality that the SOAP option supports. So if you're looking to do really advanced stuff, SOAP is probably the way to go as opposed to REST. And then the third option here is if you're actually building something on the platform with Marketing Cloud landing pages, you can use AMP script in order to submit triggered sends as well. So that's kind of just a brief overview of what transactional sending is. I'd like to talk a little bit about the triggered send definition, because this is something that kind of, I'm not going to say trips up developers a little bit, but it is something that has to be created before you can start making your API calls to submit requests. So to kind of go along with that, in order to do a transactional message, it really requires two pieces. So the first piece is the definition that I just mentioned, and that contains some metadata, and I'll show a slide here in a sec that shows what all of the fields are on the definition. And then it also requires an API request. So you can't have one without the other. You can't just fire off an API request and have it send an email without setting up the definition first. So you really got to have both. So where is the triggered email definition within the Email Studio? It's under the Interactions tab, and that's where you'll go to actually set up a triggered email definition. It is also possible to create a triggered email definition via the API. It's kind of a not very common use case just because they're typically created once, and then you're not creating them every day. So if you have a handful of campaigns that are going to be transactional, you can easily go into the UI, set up the definitions. They're there. They're going to last for as long as you need. It doesn't really make sense to write code that you're only going to run once to set up when it's so easy to go into the UI in order to accomplish that. So what does it do? It basically provides the basic metadata for the message. So there's a lot of stuff in regard to a transactional message that doesn't really change very often. So in order to make the payloads that you're sending over in your API request as small as possible so they can process as fast as possible, a lot of the static information is going to be on the definition. So that includes the from name. So the from name and address that's going to be used that the end recipient will actually see. It's going to require the email template, so the creative, basically the HTML that's going to be sent. We'll get into that a little bit later, but you do have to specify an email. And then it also has subscriber management. So how do you want to handle storing the records for these people you send transactional messages to? Do you want to add them to a list automatically of, when somebody completes a purchase, do you want to add them to a purchasers list so you can use that, for a later campaign of some sort? It is also helpful that if you have distinct definitions, you can use it to separate tracking. So if you wanted to, you could set up one definition and just route all your transactional sends through it, but you wouldn't be able to see any differentiation between it, because when you look in reporting, you just see one big bucket of here's all your transactional messages. So it really helps differentiate that as well. And then the third option here is it provides for management of sending. So you can actually pause and queue messages. So if there's something wrong with your email content and you don't want it to go out, you can quickly pause it and give you time to update that content and then resume sending with the new content. So it provides controls like that that they kind of allow it to easily be managed. So for creating a triggered email definition, there are a bunch of fields that you're going to have to define. And I already touched on the API versus UI piece. I definitely recommend, when you're first getting started, just create it in the UI and get started right away instead of doing an API call to create the definition. But some of the fields you're going to have to provide are a name. So just something so that you know what that definition is going to be used for, not something the clients or the end recipient's going to see, but just something to identify it so you know what it is. The next one is really important, the key identifier. So this is what kind of connects the UI with the API call. So in order for the API call to say what definition I'm going to use that you created in the UI, that's what the key value is used for. So it's called external key when you're looking at it in the UI. It's called customer key in the API, so it's a little confusing there. But just it's basically the unique identifier. You can set that to whatever you want, make it a friendly identifier. Some of the other options are classification, so you can actually do transactional or marketing for triggered, but obviously today we're talking about mostly transactional. You set the email content, you can set the subscriber management, and then there's some miscellaneous options, like if you wanted to CC or BCC every message to a certain email address, you could specify it there, and also set up multi-part MIME and SYN logging, some additional features that you might use in the Marketing Cloud. So best practices for triggered email definitions. I already touched on this a little bit, but definitely create separate definitions for each SYN type. So if there's anything unique about the messages being sent that you might want to differentiate them from a tracking perspective. So I mean, think of not just for tracking, but for for billing, you want to know how many messages got sent for one type of messages versus the other. If they're all in one bucket, you can't do that. So I mean, we see people differentiate obviously by the type, but also maybe if you're sending across multiple countries, you'd have one for North America, one for Europe. There's multiple ways you can slice that, whatever makes sense for your business. Next one, make sure you start your definition. So when you create a definition in the UI, it is going to be created in essentially as like a draft or a new state. So you can go out, create it, start making API calls, all your API calls are going to fail because the definition that's expecting those API requests isn't set up fully to actually accept them. There's an option in the UI for once you've created it, you click the start button. At that point, it's ready to accept requests. Kind of along that same lines is my next point. There is the concept of publishing changes to a definition. So let's say you wanted to update your email content, you wanted to update your from address. Any change to the definition or the content related to that definition is going to require you to select the publish option in the UI, also available in the API, in order for that change to go live. It is possible to pause sending so that you can make the changes and then resume it without publishing. But what that's going to do is it's going to continue using the content and all of the settings from the last time that you actually published. So it might look like you made the changes, but definitely make sure you actually click publish. A stop and a start does not inherently mean that it is published. Last item here is select a list under subscriber management. So this just really makes it a lot easier to see your subscribers and what their current status is. So if you're familiar with Marketing Cloud, you're aware of what is called an held or an undeliverable status. So if somebody bounces too much, or it's a hard bounce, it's crazy logic on bounce mail management. But basically, if we determine that we shouldn't be sending messages to them, they're going to be put in a held state. It's hard to see those if you don't select a list for that transactional volume to live on. So if you actually select a list in list management, then you can just go into the UI. It's a list of all your transactional, people you've sent transactional messages to. You can see their status right there. Otherwise, it's kind of managed internally by Marketing Cloud, not something that's easily visible. So definitely make sure you select that when creating your definition. Now we're going to go into content, so more fun. The main challenge that I see with content is just that you can control, or the scope of the content that's available in the Marketing Cloud kind of varies greatly. So we've got the option here, all the way on the left is completely static. So you could have all of the HTML images, all of the content that you're going to be sending to your end recipients in the Marketing Cloud. Everybody that gets triggered a message looks exactly the same. Perfectly valid use case for that is if you're using this to do white paper delivery. So somebody signs up on your website to receive a white paper, you want to trigger them a message to deliver that white paper. All those messages are going to look the same because all you're really doing is sending the same content over and over, but you want that to be sent out kind of ad hoc, like as soon as somebody requests it. So it's a good use case for transactional sending. One that's more common and a lot kind of more familiar, people are more familiar with, is dynamic fields. So instead of providing large blocks of content that are dynamic, what you're doing is providing individual fields. So if you wanted to address the email to the individual, you wanted to say, hello, John, and you knew the person's first name, you could address it using a simple dynamic field. Pretty common there. And then on the other side, the completely dynamic range is just if you're using content from, an external system that you want to pass in the API request, not something that necessarily lives in Marketing Cloud, but something more than just an individual field. So it might be, a block of HTML. It might be an XML snippet that then the Marketing Cloud parses to, apply a style sheet to. It can be any sort of content like that that's, not necessarily a single field, but much bigger content. And this really is kind of a spectrum. So there isn't any set, when you create your definition, you don't have to say, I'm going to create a completely static one. It's along a spectrum, essentially. So whatever makes the most sense for your particular use case, it can be configured for that. So, kind of on the range of, completely dynamic, maybe you want everything to be dynamic except for the header and footer. That's an option. Or the whole message, including the header and footer, could also be dynamic. So what are some of the advantages to these two approaches? Well, really, if you're doing the more content that's in the Marketing Cloud, it really allows the marketers to control that content. So they can go into the Marketing Cloud, use the WYSIWYG editor, make updates to whatever they want to put a new header logo in. They can do that. They can go in, update the content, publish the definition. Nobody has to change a line of code. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, if all the content's coming in from the API call, and you need to change that content, you have to change it, downstream wherever that content's coming from, whether it's, a CMS system that's external, or maybe it's hard-coded in your request that's coming in. It just doesn't provide you with as much flexibility if you are basically passing all that in the API request. Another aspect of this that I almost briefly went over, but making the amount of data that you're passing in any individual API request smaller is going to make it perform better. So if you're passing over huge payloads of data, it's going to be a large payload. It's going to reduce the throughput that you're going to be able to get through just because of its size. So keeping it small and allowing a lot of that static content to live in the Marketing Cloud, you can get a lot better throughput, a lot better, it's just going to process faster because it's just a lot easier to handle. Kind of another point I wanted to make is, even if you are using fully dynamic content, you still do have to create an email in the Marketing Cloud. So an email object that I'm referring to is just the object that holds the content. So it's what holds the HTML or the text content that's being sent. So even if you're doing completely dynamic content, you do have to create an email. And this is needed because it's how you define the encoding. It's how you define tracking attributes for that email. It's how you determine if the email is multi-part MIME. And I'm going to show an example of this when I do a demo a little bit later of what it will look like, because it kind of is counterintuitive that you'd have a template, but there's really nothing in the template. But it really is helpful for reporting purposes. So if you have a lot of our reports are based on the email name or email ID. So if you want to be able to use those canned reports, you need to use an email object. So I'm going to go into a demo here real shortly. And the first thing I wanted to kind of show you was what the content would look like in the Marketing Cloud for my demo. So here is an example password reset email for Northern Trail Outfitters. You'll see in here that we've got actually two what are called personalization or substitution strings. Our format for that is %%, the name of the attribute, %%. So you'll see it says hello first name. We're going to actually substitute in the actual first name of the recipient there. And then down in the URL there, it actually has something called a password token. So typically with a password reset, you're going to be passing in some unique token that says that this person has access to reset their password. And then what this would look like on the API side is, let's see here. Is that readable somewhat? I realize it's a lot of XML on the screen all at once, but I'm showing SOAP API. Obviously, you could do this exact same thing using the REST API. SOAP API does support using a username and password, which is what I'm using here. So those are just references to my username and password for my account. It also supports if you want to use OAuth with a token, so a short-lived token for your request, if you want to do a little bit more with security on that. Everything within the SOAP API for the Marketing Cloud is action, action, and then like what you're performing the action on. So the action we're doing in this one is actually using the create method. So we've got the create request here, saying it's a create call, and then the object that we're working with is the triggered send object. So this triggered send object just represents a request to send a triggered send email. This isn't the object for a definition. That would actually be called triggered send definition. But for this object, this is kind of a simplified example in that I'm trying to pass over as little as possible to send this message out the door. So first item I need here is the triggered send definition. So for this example, I've already created my triggered email definition. I went into the UI, created it, started it. It's ready to start accepting API requests. The only thing that I need to do in my API request is actually reference the customer key or external key that I set up when I created the definition. So in my example, that is called password reset. And then the only thing I need to provide is who I'm actually sending this to. So in my example, I've just got an Outlook address set up. So michael.clark.work@outlook.com is who I'm going to send it to. And I'm also passing a few attributes. So these attributes are basically going to match up with those dynamic fields that we saw on the last screen. So on the last screen, we saw first name and password token. So that's first name and then password token. So those just have to match up because that's how we determine what field we're going to merge into there. So I'm actually going to just initiate this request real quick. Of course, when it's a demo, it's going to take forever. Oh, there it goes. So I got a response back, simply said OK. So it accepted the request, gave me a request ID, which can be used for troubleshooting in the future if there was an issue with that triggered send call. And then I'm going to see if I can actually receive this message. So let's see. And I made sure to pick like an Outlook address, so that way if it doesn't come through, I can just blame Outlook. But hey, it came through. So here is my password reset email. I had a couple in there already just so I could show you examples if that one didn't work. But basically, here's the message that came through. In the SOAP call, it had the first name being passed as Michael. And then if you memorize that token, which is kind of gibberish, that came through in the request as well. So this is a really simple example of what our clients commonly do where, you don't need to pass in the whole payload in order to provide the message. We're able to, in the API, provide a really small payload and get these requests processed really quickly. What I'm going to show you next is actually kind of the exact opposite of that. So I'm kind of showing the opposite ends of the spectrum, even though, obviously you could have your use case be anywhere in between. So here's my next example. So this is what the email would look like within the Marketing Cloud. It kind of does look really basic. So there's no content actually stored in the Marketing Cloud. The only thing we're storing is a reference to what attribute we're going to use to pull in that personalization. So even though we're pulling in a large block of content, the actual mechanism for passing that content over is still just an attribute. So in my example here, I've got two actually. So I've got one for subject, just called subject, and then I've also got one called HTML_body for passing over a block of HTML. And there's also a little bit of AMP script in here. I'm not going to go into AMP script too much, but treat as content is a function that basically says, if you're bringing in external content, I want that content, if it has AMP script, to be resolved as well. So you could actually, have AMP script being stored or passed in from an external system, and we'll render that just as if it was, in a email on the Marketing Cloud. So you could actually pass in, scripting, and it would render that based on, current data in the account, do data extension lookups, whatever. And let's see here. So this is going to look very similar to what we just did. Again, using passwords for authentication. Triggered SYN definition is going to be different. I just called this one dynamic. So I can actually, if I looked in my account, I would be able to differentiate all of my highly dynamic messages from my password resets because they'd essentially be in two separate buckets. So I'd be able to see exactly how many of each type that I did send. I'm actually going to send this to the same address as before. And the property that I'm specifying, so the attributes array that's in this SOAP payload, is basically the same as before. I'm just referencing different names. So instead of saying first name, I'm saying HTML body. And I'm passing over, all of the HTML that I'm going to send. So this is HTML body. Just so this actually has something. X 2017. Just going to add a little bit of content there. The subject is also dynamic and can be passed in. I'm just going to have it say, this is a Trailhead X demo. And this request was successful as well, so that means it was sent to the Marketing Cloud. Marketing Cloud accepted it. It's going to process it for sending. And what we're going to be able to see when we go to Outlook is basically all of this HTML that I specified that's being passed over is all that you're going to see in the message that was received. Zoom out here. Quick. See if it comes through. Oh. Because I was a little worried that it might not come through just because, demos always go that way. I went ahead and sent one a little bit ago, actually yesterday, to kind of show you what that would look like. And it's not the most compelling email that you're going to receive in your inbox. It is just a little bit of text, but all of that text came in through an API call, completely dynamic. You don't have to store anything in the Marketing Cloud for this particular scenario. So that is the conclusion of my demo. If there are any questions, I'm up here. I'll be hanging around afterwards if you want to ask them. I'd also recommend that we do have a Marketing Cloud booth over in the developer forest. If you've got any additional questions, I would recommend going checking out that, especially if you want to see anything on Journey Builder or any of the other platforms you can develop on within the Marketing Cloud. So any questions real quick before I kind of break off for private questions? One question. So the question was, does this loop into the Salesforce data connector? What data connector are you talking about? For the core? Salesforce Connect. So does this tie into Salesforce Connect? So basically sending through the Marketing Cloud? Yeah, you can set up definitions through Marketing Cloud Connect. within the Salesforce interface, Salesforce Sales Cloud, that is, and then use the same APIs to trigger messages to them, and then that tracking data will flow back to Sales and Service Cloud. Another question? The question is about sending images within transactional messages and kind of best practices around that. I mean, the best option would be to actually upload those to the Marketing Cloud first, so to get them into the distribution network that's available there, as opposed to hosting them somewhere else. And it's also not a very good idea to pass in like a base 64 encoded string, because it just makes for a really large payload. So that's definitely not a good idea. But yeah, best practice, upload those, and then just you could always pass in a reference to that HTML or that path for that image. So I think I'm about to get kicked out of here, but if there are any questions, I'll be right over here. Thank you, everybody, for coming.